Jacob Miller's driveway was suddenly blocked by a bizarre metal barrier, stopping him from taking his rodeo equipment to the big show, a brazen violation of his property and passion. The HOA patrol, led by a neighbor's scheming influence, seemed to delight in asserting power over the innocent, stirring outrage throughout the neighborhood. But with the loyalty and courage of his friends, Emily, Michael, and Danny, Jacob turned the tables, breaking through the blockade and reclaiming what was rightfully his. And just wait until you see how this showdown unfolded, and why justice, in the end, triumphantly prevailed. Jacob Miller had always cherished his quiet Saturday mornings. The sun was just beginning to spill gold across the cul-de-sac, painting the neatly trimmed lawns and familiar facades of the suburban neighborhood in a warm glow. Birds chirped in the trees, and the faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance added a comforting rhythm to the day. Jacob felt a rare sense of peace as he stepped out of his front door, ready to begin what should have been an ordinary, routine morning. But nothing about that morning would be ordinary. As he took the first few steps onto the driveway, Jacob's eyes immediately landed on his front gate, and he froze. What he saw made him blink twice, thinking perhaps his sleep-deprived mind was playing tricks on him. A strange, rigid metal barrier had been set up across the driveway, completely blocking his path. It wasn't the usual chain link or simple barricade that construction crews sometimes left behind. This was professional-looking, tall enough to be inconvenient, and oddly menacing in its unexpected presence. Behind the barrier stood two figures, their posture rigid, hands resting at their sides, eyes scanning the street as if guarding something. They wore bright orange vests, the kind that made them impossible to ignore. On each vest, bold black letters spelled out, HOA Patrol. Jacob's mind raced. HOA Patrol? The neighborhood association had never sent anyone directly to his home like this. Not in 15 years of living on Maplewood Drive. And they certainly hadn't ever installed a blockade across a private driveway. What? He whispered aloud, the words catching in his throat. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, trying to make sense of the situation. His pulse began to quicken as he scanned the scene for some clue that this was a mistake. Maybe it was a mix-up, a delivery perhaps, or a maintenance crew that had misread the address. But no, the vest clearly said HOA Patrol, and the barrier was sturdy, immovable, and deliberately placed. It wasn't going anywhere without some kind of action, and he was trapped on the wrong side. Jacob's stomach dropped. His mind instantly shifted from disbelief to practical panic. Behind the gate, his rodeo equipment sat piled in the backyard, all of it necessary for the big show later that day. Saddles, barrels, ropes, even the specially trained horse. Everything he had worked for over the past months depended on him being able to get it out. And now, it was inaccessible, sealed off by strangers claiming authority he had never recognized. A wave of helplessness swept over him. He tried to remember every rule he had agreed to when he moved into the neighborhood. HOA regulations could be strict, but blocking someone's personal driveway, that was not part of any rule he had ever read. And yet, here it was. The stark, glaring presence of the barrier made it painfully clear. These people were taking action, and he had no idea why. His hands went to his face as he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel the first flicker of anger, sharp and cold, but underneath it, there was fear, a quiet, growing dread. What would happen if he couldn't get his equipment out? What would happen if he missed the show he had been preparing for all year? The thought of disappointing his friends, his team, and even himself felt unbearable. Jacob glanced around the street, half expecting neighbors to be watching, confused or judgmental, but the morning seemed untouched, serene, oblivious to the chaos on his driveway. The contrast made the shock even more surreal. It wasn't just a gate. It was a challenge, an interruption of everything he relied on, everything he loved, and everything that made Saturday special. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he crouched slightly, trying to assess the barrier. Was it heavy? Could it be moved? No. It had been installed with care, anchored to the posts with thick metal clamps. This was not temporary. This was deliberate. Jacob straightened, his jaw tight, trying to push down the panic. Today was supposed to be about rodeo, about skill and friendship and joy. Instead, it had become a morning of confusion, disbelief, and mounting urgency. He knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't just stand there. He needed a plan, allies, and answers. And fast. But for now, all he could do was stare at the two orange vests and the immovable metal barrier, frozen in shock, heart pounding as the quiet suburban morning carried on around him, utterly unaware of the storm that had just landed at his front gate. Jacob Miller felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped back from the gate, his mind trying to grasp the absurdity of what was happening. The barrier still loomed, silent yet oppressively authoritative, while the two figures in orange vests stood like sentinels, their faces unreadable. Every instinct inside him screamed that this was wrong. Every rule he had ever followed, every agreement he had signed when moving into the neighborhood, made it clear no one had the right to block his property. He was still frozen in disbelief when a familiar voice broke through the tension. "That's the new HOA schemer. He just loves terrorizing people," said Tommy Harris, his neighbor and longtime friend, as he leaned on the fence separating their yards. Tommy's eyes flicked toward the barricade, narrowing with unmistakable irritation. "Don't let him rattle you. He's been doing this all over town. People can't keep their driveways clear. He just likes the control." Jacob felt his chest tighten. The word terrorizing hung in the air, sharp and stinging. He wanted to argue that it wasn't that dramatic, but deep down he knew Tommy was right. This wasn't an accidental mistake or a bureaucratic error. This was intentional. Someone had chosen to stand in his way, to block him from his own property, and the audacity of it left a bitter taste in his mouth. As his mind reeled, the anger started to rise. A slow, steady burn that grew with every heartbeat. These HOA patrol members weren't just innocent enforcers of neighborhood rules. They were intruders, wielding authority that didn't belong to them. They were attempting to assert dominance over people who had worked hard to make this neighborhood their home. And for Jacob, that realization struck like a physical blow. His hands clenched into fists, gripping the edges of his jacket as he paced the length of the driveway. His heart raced, not with fear this time, but with a growing, almost righteous fury. He thought of his rodeo equipment, carefully maintained over months of practice and preparation. The saddles, ropes, and barrels, all meticulously polished and positioned, were more than just tools. They were the culmination of years of dedication, sweat, and love for the sport that defined him. And now all of that was being held hostage by a pair of strangers who thrived on intimidation. Jacob's gaze returned to the barrier, this time with clear focus. It wasn't official. It was a power move, a display designed to provoke fear, confusion, and compliance. The realization hit him hard. The HOA patrol wasn't protecting anyone. They were asserting control over others, and he was their latest target. The thought sent a surge of indignation through him. How dare they? How dare someone treat a neighborhood, a community, like it was theirs to manipulate? Tommy's words echoed in his mind. He just loves terrorizing people. And that's when Jacob felt it fully. The raw, unfiltered hatred for the injustice of it. He hated the arrogance, the presumption, the thoughtless disruption of lives that were orderly, disciplined, and meaningful. He hated the way the strangers assumed authority over him, over his passion, over his Saturday morning that should have been filled with anticipation and excitement. The intensity of the anger was liberating in a strange way. It was no longer just shock or disbelief. It was personal. This wasn't abstract. It wasn't a story of bureaucracy or policy. It was his life, his dreams, and his freedom being challenged. Every muscle in his body seemed to tense in preparation for action. Jacob felt a fierce clarity. He would not submit. He would not back down. And for the first time, Jacob allowed himself to imagine pushing back, not in violence, but with determination, with strategy, with the support of those who understood him, those who shared his values, and those who would never let arbitrary power go unchallenged. The anger transformed into resolve. This barrier, this intrusion, this audacious display of control, he would not let it stand. For the first time that morning, Jacob smiled, albeit tightly. Hatred was a heavy emotion, but it was also fuel. And Jacob Miller had never been afraid to use fire to defend what was his. Jacob Miller slammed his phone shut and felt a surge of determination, unlike anything he had experienced that morning. The orange-vested figures hadn't just blocked his gate. They had attempted to interfere with his passion, with the rhythm of his life that revolved around the rodeo. And now they would learn that Jacob Miller was not someone to be trifled with. He dialed his closest rodeo friends, his voice steady but urgent. "Emily, Michael, Danny," he began. "We've got a serious problem today. I need your help." He didn't need to explain everything. They knew him. They knew the stakes. And they knew his rodeo wasn't just a hobby. It was a way of life. Within minutes, the group was mobilizing. By the time Jacob heard the familiar clip-clop of hooves on the asphalt, a wave of relief washed over him. Emily's chestnut mare, Michael's dark bay stallion, and Danny's spirited palomino were all waiting in his yard, nostrils flaring, muscles coiled with energy. The friends rode in like a storm about to break, their presence alone radiating strength and determination. Jacob's heart swelled, not just with pride, but with the fierce energy of shared purpose. Together, they approached the metal barrier. It seemed almost laughable now, this flimsy attempt to intimidate them, yet Jacob's anger kept his nerves taut. Every pounding step of hooves, every swish of a tail felt like a declaration. We will not be stopped. The HOA patrol officers shifted nervously, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond their simple intimidation tactics. Jacob's voice rang out over the clatter. "Move aside. This is our property, and we're not letting anyone stand in our way." His friends echoed him, their own voices firm and resolute. For a brief moment, the air felt electric, charged with the collision of willpower and righteousness. The orange-vested figures hesitated, trying to maintain control, but the sheer force of Jacob's anger, combined with the coordinated movement of skilled riders and powerful horses, created an unstoppable momentum. Emily guided her mare forward with precise confidence. Michael maneuvered his stallion to flank the barrier, and Danny's Palomino nudged from the opposite side, creating an unrelenting pressure that made resistance impossible. Jacob felt a surge of triumph as the barrier began to shift. It rattled under the combined weight and insistence of determination and experience. This was not aggression. It was justice in motion, the kind of justice that arises when people defend what is rightfully theirs with skill, courage, and unwavering solidarity. Step by step, the obstacle moved, bending the rules that the HOA patrol had so arrogantly tried to impose. Finally, with one last synchronized push, the metal barrier swung aside. The gate creaked open, a sound that resonated like a release of tension that had been building for hours. Jacob felt a roar of exhilaration bubble up inside him, mingled with relief. They had done it. The barrier was gone and the path to his rodeo was clear. The friends rode in a celebratory circle, hooves kicking up dust, tails flicking, the sun glinting off their determined faces. Laughter mixed with exhilaration as Jacob dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a sense of finality. The anger that had consumed him only moments before had transformed into satisfaction and empowerment. Together, they had faced down a needless authority and reclaimed what was theirs. In that moment, Jacob realized something profound. Anger, when harnessed with courage and the support of true friends, could be a force of extraordinary change. It wasn't reckless fury. It was righteous, purposeful, and it had restored balance. The HOA patrol could not have anticipated the unity, skill, and resolve of Jacob and his rodeo crew, and as he looked at Emily, Michael, and Danny, a deep sense of gratitude and pride settled in his chest. They had cleared the way, not just for the rodeo that day, but for the principle that no one could block their passion with empty authority. The sun hung low over the quiet neighborhood, casting long golden rays that glittered on Jacob Miller's freshly cleared driveway. The tension that had gripped him since that shocking morning had finally begun to dissipate. His heart still raced, a mixture of adrenaline and elation pulsing through him, but a deep, satisfying calm had settled in its place. The gate, once blocked by a brazen display of authority from people who had no right to be there, now stood open. The air smelled faintly of dust and hay carried by the hooves of Emily, Michael, and Danny's horses as they shook themselves, proud and strong after the morning's efforts. Jacob took a deep breath, letting the relief wash over him. Every nerve in his body still hummed from the ordeal, but he felt lighter, freer. He looked at his friends, their faces flushed with excitement, their smiles wide and genuine. They embraced one another, laughter mingling with the soft nickers of their horses. It wasn't just celebration. It was acknowledgement of shared courage, loyalty, and the bond that had been tested and proven that day. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to reflect on the absurdity and audacity of the fake HOA enforcers. They had come armed with little more than a flimsy metal barrier and the illusion of authority, attempting to disrupt his life and passion. But in the end, they had left empty-handed, disarmed, not by violence, but by determination, skill, and the unbreakable support of friendship. Jacob smiled, realizing how small their presence had been in the face of something far greater, his resolve and the loyalty of those who stood by him. He walked slowly to the gate, running his fingers over the smooth metal that had been both obstacle and challenge. The barrier was gone, yet it left behind more than just an open path. It left a story of triumph, courage, and unity. Jacob knew that the neighborhood would talk about today for a long time, not about the HOA patrol and their antics, but about the way ordinary people had come together to defend what was rightfully theirs. It was a reminder that strength is not measured by authority or position, but by commitment to your values and to those who stand with you. Emily, Michael, and Danny gathered around him, and Jacob felt a swell of gratitude. "We did it," he said quietly, almost to himself, but his friends nodded knowingly. They had faced intimidation, absurd rules, and unexpected challenges, yet none of it had broken their spirit. Every step, every push, every coordinated movement with their horses had been a declaration. This is ours, and we will not be deterred. That day, courage had worn no armor, and yet it had been more powerful than anything the so-called enforcers had brought. As Jacob mounted his horse and glanced down the open driveway, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The rodeo awaited him, yes, but this victory was deeper. It was about justice restored, about the affirmation that dedication, courage, and loyalty can overcome obstruction and intimidation. Even the simple act of riding through that open gate felt triumphant. The neighborhood, too, had witnessed it. The lesson clear for all who had watched from the sidelines. Respect, fairness, and courage can prevail, even against those who try to impose themselves without reason. With a final glance at his friends, who stood proud and steady beside their horses, Jacob felt an enduring inspiration settle in his chest. That day would be remembered not just for the rodeo, but for the strength of bonds tested in fire, and the reminder that true justice often comes from ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. He nudged his horse forward, the gate fully open, the path ahead wide and unblocked, carrying with him the certainty that courage, friendship, and unwavering commitment to what is right would always find a way. And as the trio of riders and their steeds moved down the sunlit street toward the rodeo, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, watching and learning. Sometimes the greatest victories are not loud or violent, but built on loyalty, courage, and the unyielding drive to protect what truly matters. The lesson lingered in the warm afternoon air, leaving a sense of inspiration that would not fade with the sunset.